welcome you to this AVERT research webinar. My name is Michelle Grossman, and I'm the convener of AVERT. And we are absolutely thrilled to have with us today Ryan Scrivens, who's going to be talking to us about a topic that I know has been of consuming interest to many of us who are on this webinar, which is the online behavior of right-wing extremists. And I don't think I need to tell anybody on this Zoom why that is a critically important and also really fascinating topic to be exploring today. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Matteo Vergani, who is going to be hosting and facilitating this session with Ryan. But just before I do, a couple of very quick housekeeping things. As is the usual format with these webinars, everybody will be on mute. We will have about 20 minutes at the end of Ryan's presentation for questions and discussion. If you have questions, feel free to post them as Ryan is speaking, but please put them in the Q&A and we will manage the questions there so that we have a really good flow of dialogue and discussion towards the end. And that is really it for the housekeeping stuff. So Matteo will now introduce Ryan and take us away. So over to you, Matteo.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you, Ryan, for joining us, even if I know there is a big time difference between us. Look, let me introduce very quickly Ryan. Ryan is a very talented scholar who is making a really important contribution to terrorism research, to the field. Ryan has been addressing key questions in terrorism studies about the relationships between online and offline behavior. So we know that they are interrelated. We know that there is an association between the two, a co-occurrence many times. We don't know much else. Is there an association or a causation between online extremism and offline violence? And if there is a causation, is online extremism a necessary or a sufficient cause or condition for real-world violence? So these are largely unanswered questions, and Ryan's work contributes to address them. But let me tell you that I think one of the most important contributions of Ryan is methodological. So we know that the field of terrorism studies has been debating for years the need to have control groups in study designs. And systematic reviews of the field, and I did one, found that the use of control groups is very rare in our field of study. So Ryan found clever ways to include control groups in his study designs, looking at what makes violent and non-violent extremists different. And today Ryan is going to present a study in which exactly he uses control groups. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Ryan, and at the end of the presentation, I will moderate the Q&A questions. Thank you, Ryan. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much for having me today. My name is Dr. Ryan Scrivens, and I'm going to be presenting a paper titled Comparing the Online Posting Behaviors of Violent and Non-Violent Right-Wing Extremists. This paper was recently published in Terrorism and Political Violence, and it was co-authored with Wally Wozniacki, an assistant prof at Michigan State, Joshua Freilich at John Jay, Steve Cermak at MSU as well, and Richard Frank at Simon Fraser University. So just as a little bit of a background before I delve into the study. So like most of us, violent extremists and terrorists often leave a digital footprint behind, including right-wing extremists. As a few recent and notable example, Anders Breivik, the Norwegian far-right terrorist convicted of killing 77 people in 2011, was a registered member of white supremacy web forum and also had ties to various far-right social media sites. Dylan Roof, the 21-year-old who murdered 9 Black parishioners in South Carolina in 2015, allegedly posted messages on an extremist website, as well as hosted his own website with a contained alleged manifesto of his. And lastly, I'm sure everybody in the call is very familiar with this case. Tarek, the 28-year-old who, before killing 50 people in 2 Christchurch mosques in 2019 and live streaming his attacks, announced his intention on 8chan or 8kun and produced a manifesto linked on that website. So in these cases, many practitioners, researchers, and policymakers raise questions about, 1, the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism in general, and 2, the impact of an offender's consumption of and networking around violent extremist online content and their acceptance of extremist ideologies and or their decisions to engage in violent extremism and terrorism in particular. Understandably, questions are also raised about whether such violent individuals can be identified online prior to their attacks offline. But as Matteo alluded to, despite these ongoing concerns, few empirically grounded analyses have identified which online users have engaged in violent extremism offline and then assessed their digital footprints, and even fewer analyses have identified differences in posting behaviors of those who share extremist ideological beliefs but are violent or non-violent offline. So in other words, or in very simple terms, research has overwhelmingly focused on identifying and examining quote unquote radicals or extremists online, and not those who adhere to radical beliefs but are also violent offline. So this was the impetus of the current study. So we examined the posting behavioral patterns of both violent and non-violent right-wing extremists within a subforum of the largest white supremacy web forum, STORMFRONT.org. Here we investigated if violent right-wing extremists are differentially active online compared to their non-violent extremist counterpart. Just as a bit of an overview, what I'm going to be discussing today is within the current study, I'm going to briefly discuss the data and sample, the measures, the analytical strategy, the results, key takeaways, limitations, and future research. And if I have a couple minutes after, I don't want to go over on time, I'll talk about some of the current work we're doing based on this data I'm going to be discussing. So we examined all posts made by a sample of violent, non-violent right-wing extremists in the open access sections of STORMFRONT Canada. So STORMFRONT Canada is a Canadian themed subforum of STORMFRONT, and I'll discuss later why we chose STORMFRONT Canada. But it's important to keep in mind that users who post in this platform aren't necessarily Canadian. I would argue that the vast majority are, but you do get people from other parts of the world, including Australia, the UK, America, posting in this Canadian themed subforum. Just as a bit of a background of STORMFRONT, it's the oldest and largest racial hate site in the world, and it's one of the most active right-wing extremist forums to this day. It has been losing a bit of momentum, but you still get a lot of content posted on that platform. Today, it has over 350,000 members and over 13.5 million posts. So it's a big space. It also includes an array of subforums addressing a variety of topics ranging from culture to politics to ideologies to poetry corner to money and tech. I argue it includes different strokes for different folks, but cemented in the background are extremist ideologies. But perhaps most notably is that it has hosted some of the deadliest right-wing extremists since its inception. So it's not just a space where you get keyboard warriors or people who hang out in their mom's basement, for example, just spewing hatred. You have people who actually engage in violence offline. So although several emerging online spaces have been adopted by right-wing extremists, particularly the newer generation in recent years, including Gab, Reddit, the Chans, TikTok, Parler, Telegram, so on and so forth, researchers argue, including Matteo in one of his more recent studies, that STORMFRONT continues to be a valuable space to assess posting behaviors, including radical posting behaviors, developments in user activity and extremist language, developments in collective identity formation, and the impact of presidential elections on online behaviors. However, research has yet to identify differences in posting patterns of STORMFRONT users who share extremist ideological beliefs, but are violent or non-violent offline. So again, this is where we dig in. So in terms of the data collection and sampling, we proceeded in 2 stages. Stage 1 consisted of automatically collecting data. So Richard Frank, he's one of the co-authors on this paper. He's a computer scientist by trade. He's also a criminologist. So he developed this web crawl that essentially what you do is you input parameters for a new task, the new task being, okay, we want to collect all of the content on Stormfront Canada. It then speaks to its database, which then speaks to the virtual machines, which then looks on the internet for a designated website. And then what the virtual machines will do will visit all of the pages that make up that website and automatically download those pages, almost like a spidering technique or tool. And then all of the data will then be stored down into a database, and we have the content to work with. So for this exercise, when we downloaded Stormfront Canada, it consisted of over 125,000 posts made by over 7,000 users between 2001 and 2017 when we collected the data. But perhaps more interesting for those who haven't read the paper that I'm presenting on today or haven't heard me talk about it is the identification of the samples. Some of you are probably wondering, how can you identify violent and non-violent right-wing extremists online? Well, I've gotten a little bit crafty over the years. What I did for this particular exercise was a former violent extremist who was actively involved in the North American right-wing extremist movement reviewed a list of usernames who posted in the subforum and selected those who matched one of the two user types. So I'll break this down for you. So I sat with this former extremist. I gave him or her a list of usernames in Stormfront Canada. And the reason why we selected Stormfront Canada, and this is, I guess, off the record. This individual was actively involved in the Canadian movement. He or she was also involved in the North American movement, but he or she had a large presence in the Canadian movement. So he or she had a pretty good sense of the online dynamic of the Canadian movement, especially on Stormfront. He or she was largely a recruiter in these platforms. So he or she knew who was who based on usernames. So he or she went through a list of usernames and picked out people who he or she knew during his or her time in the violent right-wing extremist movement were violent or non-violent. So we went through this list. Okay, this person was violent. Okay, this person was violent. Okay, this person was non-violent. So each time that the former identified users of interest, they were asked to explain in as much detail as possible why the user was identified as violent or non-violent right-wing extremists. They were also asked to provide examples of the activities that each identified user engaged in, as well as their association with or connection to each user. And in short, the reason for this was to do the very best to identify to verify the authenticity of each user identified by the former. I really wanted to gauge what the relationship was with this former and people who they were picking out, and really delve into whether this person was in fact violent or non-violent that they picked out. So in total, the former picked out 49 violent users and 49 violent users and 50 non-violent users, which amassed to approximately 30,000 posts. The first post was made in 2004 and the last was 2017. And for the violent users, they amassed approximately 12.6 thousand posts, and the non-violent amassed approximately 17.7 thousand posts. Some of you are probably wondering, okay, how are we defining violent right-wing extremists? So for this particular exercise or study, violent right-wing extremists were those who committed several acts of known physical violence, including violent attacks against minorities and anti-racist groups. And this could be sporadic or planned. It was oftentimes both. They were just violent individuals, according to the former. And again, they provided examples. The non-violent extremists were actively involved in the right-wing extremist movement and activities offline, including rallies, marches, protests, poster and flyering campaigns and gatherings, but they did not engage in physical violence in any known capacity to the former right-wing extremists. Now, in terms of the measures, there were a total of 7 of them. So the first 2 was total forum posts and total sub-forum posts. So both were measured as frequency count for each individual user. Next, we had posts per month in the subforum. This was a calculation of the first and last date on which individual users posted in the subforum. The fourth measure was initiation month in the subforum. So this was the month that each user made their first post in the subforum relative to the lifespan of the forum. So say the forum was created in 2001. If a user posted in that first month, then they would receive a score of 1. If that user posted in the second month, then they would receive a score of 2, so on and so forth. Now, the fifth measure was active months in the subform. So this acted as a time variable, which allowed us to delineate or break down posting behavior across the month following the date of users' first post or initial posts in the subform. Dormancy status in the subform. So this variable explored the posting status of users as either someone being active or someone being dormant. So dormancy in this context was operationalized as a span of 24 consecutive months that users generated 0 new posts in the subform following their first subform post. And lastly, violent status. So this was the binary variable which delineated violent and nonviolent users into 2 groups, 1 being violent, 0 being nonviolent. Again, this was based on the former extremist saying, okay, this individual was violent, or okay, this individual was nonviolent. Now, in terms of the analytical strategy, this proceeded in 3 phases. The first was plotting of posting frequency, the second was survival analysis, and the last one was logistic regression. So just as a quick and dirty breakdown, the plotting of posting frequency involved descriptive plotting of average posting trajectory for the full sample, and then it was broken down by violent status, whether violent or nonviolent. The survival analysis, it essentially provides the rate at which users either stayed active or went dormant at some point in the study period, both for the full sample and then broken down by violent status. And lastly, logistic regression. So here what we do is we examine the relevance of key variables, those variables I just listed, whether they're associated with being violent or nonviolent, with results described in the forms of odd ratios. So for those who took stats and you know what I'm talking about. For those who didn't, how you essentially break it down or how you report on logistic regression is the predicted change in the odds of being a violent user based on a 1-unit increase in an independent variable net of all other variables in the model. For those who this is just kind of completely over your head, when I get into the results, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So enough of the technical jargon, let's get into some of the results. So for phase 1, interestingly, for the full sample, there was a general negative trend in posting frequency following a sharp spike after month 1 of posting activity in the subform. So what we see here is we see a sharp spike, a sharp increase in posting activity of the full sample. So that would be a combination of the violent and nonviolent. But then you notice over time, you start to see a steady decrease in posting activity. But figure 2 describes these same analyses, but we break it down by violence status, which paints a much more complex picture. So to illustrate, for the nonviolent group, they showed some spikes in posting frequency through the entire study period, but their average posting frequency remained relatively stable across time. You can see in this diagram here, there's a little bit of fluctuation, but it seems pretty consistent all the way through. This is for the nonviolent group. Conversely, there was much greater variance in the posting frequency for the violent group. So the violent group, they generally demonstrated an early spike in posting frequency up till approximately month 13. Following month 13, their average posting frequency immediately declined sharply and then demonstrated a steady decline. So we're seeing this kind of initial spike, and then we start to see this real trailing off in posting behavior of the violent users. However, it should be noted, and I'm going to discuss this more in the limitations, that there was a lack of statistical significance in the average posting frequency between the violent and nonviolent groups at any point in the study period. And like I said, I'll discuss this a little more after. So phase 2, looking at survival analysis. So figure 3 illustrates the survival rate for the full sample, so the combination of the violent and the nonviolent users. Here we see a steady dropout rate of users throughout the entire study period, with approximately 50% of the full sample surviving to the end. Now, when you break it down by user type, figure 4 describes survival rates for the violent users versus the nonviolent group. And in short, what we see is that the violent group demonstrates quicker time to dormancy than the nonviolent group. These differences in survival rates were statistically significant for months 18 to 20, as you can see in this diagram here. In addition, approximately 55% of the non-violent group survived to the end of the study period, whereas only 40% of the violent group survived. But despite this 15% difference in final survival rates, this difference was not statistically significant. And I'll talk statistical significance with you in the limitations after. Now the final phase, phase 3, the logistic regression. Interestingly, total subforum posts, dormancy status, and initiation month in the subforum were not statistically associated with violent status, as you can see in table 1. On the other hand, it was the total forum post that emerged as significantly associated with violent status. So in other words, having less total forum posts throughout the study period was associated with greater odds of being a violent user. Now, some of you are probably wondering, so like, what does all of this mean then? There's a lot of information just thrown at you. So I'm going to spend the last half of this presentation talking about the key takeaways, study limitations, and I think there'll be some time left to talk about the current projects that we're working on based on this data. So the first key takeaway is around decrease in posting behavior. So interestingly, one, there was a general decline in posting behavior over time for the right-wing extremists in the study. And two, there was a steady dropout in posting frequency for approximately half of the sample. So this is noteworthy because it suggests that right-wing extremists in the current study, whether violent or non-violent, generally do not decrease in posting behavior over time. These findings actually contrast empirical research, which found a steady increase in user participation in right-wing extremist online spaces, as well as studies that conceptualize right-wing extremist platforms as polarizing over time, or some would maybe call it radicalizing over time. We're not necessarily finding that. We're noticing people are, the violent and non-violent group, are actually decreasing in posting behavior over time. They're not necessarily becoming more extreme based on their posting patterns or the frequency with which they post. But our findings do actually align with other empirical work, which suggests that the majority of those who post in right-wing extremist online spaces tend to desist and tail off of their posting behavior over time. It's kind of a split right now. There's not a lot of research in this space, but our work seems to align with some work that suggests that people don't actually increase in their posting behavior in right-wing extremist platforms. However, and this is a big however and really interesting, our findings may be a symptom of the study sample. Each user was either a violent or non-violent right-wing extremist, and they were actively involved in right-wing extremism. It's reasonable to assume then that posting in the open access section of a subforum may have become a concern to the users over time, given their offline activities. They were involved in violence, illegal activity, organizing questionable rallies, flyering campaigns, recruitment, so on and so forth. Research on the online behaviors of right-wing extremists suggests that those who are actively involved in right-wing extremist activities offline are oftentimes concerned that law enforcement and anti-racist groups like Antifa and others are monitoring their online activities and may in turn modify their posting behaviors to avoid detection. Right-wing extremists in the current study may have also been concerned that by posting in the publicly viewed space, again, like I said at the beginning, we were looking at open access section of a web forum, they may be putting themselves in a vulnerable position, i.e. they could become the subject of an investigation. Now, the second key takeaway is around the low profile posting behavior. So from a policy perspective, our results suggest that analysts who are searching for signs of violent extremism online should perhaps be less concerned about investigating high-frequency posters and more concerned about those who post fewer messages online. This is because, one, violent right-wing extremists in our sample posted more subforums at the beginning. They posted quite a bit, but then they posted a lot less than non-violent right-wing extremists later in their portion of their posting careers. And two, violent right-wing extremists in our sample also desisted in posting frequency at a much quicker rate than their non-violent counterparts. And the only observed characteristic of violent status was having less total number of posts in the broader forum. So if you posted less in the broader forum, chances are you were not a violent extremist. So in other words, violent right-wing extremists in our study tend to be those who are much less active online than non-violent right-wing extremists, which is interesting. Research has actually similarly found that violent right-wing extremists are clandestine, oftentimes paranoid because of the violence that they engage in turn are concerned about revealing their identities. It makes sense, right? And similar to previous research that highlights how some violent right-wing extremists alter their online behaviors to avoid detection from law enforcement and others, what we see is that the waning and inactive posting behavior of the violent right-wing extremists in our sample may reflect this security concern. Now, limitations in future research. This is always my favorite section. So I'm going to get into the statistical stuff now. So as some of you, some of the stats heads out there, it's quite clear we have a relatively small sample size. It likely contributed to the power problem that was manifest in some of the null findings. And that's despite relatively large differences between the violent and non-violent groups. While in some ways this tempers the findings and their implications, this should really spur future research to gather a more robust sample in order to provide a much stronger understanding of the posting behaviors of violent and non-violent right-wing extremists in general, and right-wing extremists in particular. The second is around the violence status variable. So this variable essentially lacks specificity in measurement that allows for the establishment of temporal ordering with independent variables of interest. So in simple terms, or in other words, it really is unclear if changes in posting behaviors are driving changes in offending or vice versa. And our analysis is instead limited to being understood as associations only at this point. So future research should therefore pinpoint exact moments in time that individuals engage in violence offline, as well as the kind of violence they engage in, the motives, the victims, so on and so forth, and then assess their posting behavior both before and after the act of violence. Doing so would probably or most likely shed light on whether specific posting behaviors in the online world escalate to violent action in the offline world. So in terms of the data is interesting because people don't have access to this kind of data, but there's problems with it, obviously. There remains many unanswered questions about the characteristics of those identified as violent or non-violent right-wing extremists in the current study. So our data does not include information on key characteristics identified in the terrorism literature, for example, and offline activities and behaviors of violent and non-violent right-wing extremists, including or such as an individual's employment status, criminal record, history of mental illness, extremist or radicalized peer, and types of grievances, amongst others. Some of these are key characteristics that characterize whether someone is likely to be a violent extremist or not. So future research is therefore needed to assess whether these characteristics and others mirror our sample of violence or non-violent right-wing extremists, as well as whether certain characteristics drive differential posting behaviors online. And one key informant, this is probably the most obvious. While the novelty of our data cannot be underestimated, their validity is based on one key former right-wing extremist. Future research should therefore verify the authenticity of each right-wing extremist user by identifying, for example, the birth and given name of each user identified by the right-wing extremist in the sample. These names could then be triangulated with open source intelligence, such as media reports, court documents, terrorism databases, social media accounts, so on and so forth, or with Freilich and Cermak's ECDB, the Extremist Crime Database, for example. The ECDB currently includes over 500 data points on nearly 1,000 violent and 1.5 thousand nonviolent right-wing extremists. And certainly, triangulating these data could further inform law enforcement and intelligence communities on the online discussions that may result in offline extremist violence, as well as shed light on the nexus between the on and offline world of violent and nonviolent right-wing extremists, or extremists more generally. So I still have a couple minutes. Yep, I still have about 10 minutes. I'm going to just talk for a few about the current work in progress. The data that we have is really, really interesting. It's not large, but it's interesting. So we've continued to work on projects. One we're just starting right now is we're starting to conduct a social network analysis of the interactions within and between the violent and nonviolent right-wing extremists, as well as their interactions with forum users generally. It'd be interesting, for example, to see who some of the opinion leaders are in these spaces, whether the opinion leaders are in fact the nonviolent extremists or whether they're the violent extremists, whether violent extremists flock together essentially and only connect and communicate with each other, at least in the open access portion of the internet, whether they're actively connecting and communicating with the nonviolent extremists or whether they're just connecting with anybody on the forum in general. We've started to conduct a longitudinal comparison of violence and violent right-wing extremist identity formation online. So what we're doing is we're taking a look at how othering or targeting perceived enemies takes shape and forms across time when comparing the violent versus non-violent groups. And something we're also working on is posting typologies. We're trying to develop these measures. We're in the process. It's looking quite good so far of these different typologies. Super posters, dabblers, the committed, people who are just posting a little bit, people who are posting a lot, and seeing what those look like. It's interesting, for example, if we can try to generate knowledge on whether these nonviolent users are in fact the super posters, perhaps the opinion leaders online, or whether maybe it's the nonviolent users who are the super posters. I don't think it's the violent users. I think that they're probably concerned about getting arrested, so they're probably not connecting and communicating, at least in the open access portion of the internet. But that's something that we're exploring further. And I'm leading. I'm doing this piece solo. What I'm doing is I'm examining online indicators of extremism among violent and nonviolent right-wing extremists. What I've essentially started to do is I've been coding a random sample of 1,000 messages from the violent users, and then a random sample of 1,000 posts of the nonviolent, and then coding for the presence of extremist ideologies, expressed grievances, and violent mobilization efforts. And then as another control group, because I like control groups, I suppose, is drawing a sample of 1,000 posts of a random sample within the online space to see whether in fact, okay, maybe we're seeing differences in posting behaviors between violent and nonviolent extremists, but are they that different from the general population in an online space? So that's all for me, folks. I really look forward to your questions. I'm here all night.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed a lot, and I'm sure everyone did. Yeah, I have a lot of ideas more than questions, because actually you're doing, I think, most of the questions I had are in the future research space. So really looking at how, we can further understand the differences between violent and non-violent users. Look, we start with a couple of questions from Michelle, which are in the chat. So the first is, Michelle, do you want to jump in and ask the question?
No, Matteo, that's fine. You take it away.
Good. Thanks. So do you think that the variation in violent versus non-violent posting frequency suggests that non-violent extremists derive more satisfaction or sense of efficacy from continued communication interaction online than the violent group?
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing I need to be doing more is doing an in-depth qualitative analysis of the conversations that each of these groups are having. My hunch or my guess would be that the nonviolent extremists are probably those who are what a lot of people call, in some ways, keyboard warriors. They will go out to the rallies, they will go to the marches, perhaps, but maybe their identity is largely wrapped up in online communications, as opposed to the violent users who their identity is, I would assume, more largely wrapped up in engaging in violence and connecting and communicating with violent users offline. What I will say, so like I said, I have those 3 projects or 4 projects that I discussed at the end. A couple of them are done. There's another one that's under review right now, so I don't want to speak too much about it yet. But what I will say about when I've coded for grievances, ideologies, and mobilization efforts of the violent and non-violent. And what is quite clear as of right now is there are pretty stark differences in identity formation, efforts to mobilize others offline. What I'm noticing is that the nonviolent extremists are a lot more active than the violent users. They're expressing grievances at a higher rate. They're expressing their extremist ideologies at a much higher rate than the violent users, as well as they're trying to mobilize others to engage in not necessarily violence, but engage in pamphleting campaigns, flyering campaigns, to meet up, to engage in rallies offline. I'm not sure if that answers your question exactly. I do think, though, I do need to be continuing to dig into this into the data to really gauge these nuances around whether people are wrapped in this online identity or whether the offline identity is equally important.
Ryan, let me read out a question from John H. Probably I know who this person is.
Yeah, I saw Jorge. Yeah, Jorge's in here. Yeah.
Yes. It's the question says, very intrigued by your recommendation that those who do most of the posting should not be the main focus. So this week, President Biden singled out 12 people, dubbed the disinformation dozen, responsible for most of the disinformation about COVID-19. And can I add, it's the same everywhere in the European Union. They found 5 people who are the most super spreaders. So could you say a little more about your argument?
Yeah, so I mean, John brings up a good point, because I think maybe what he's getting at, and I should have provided a little more nuance around that point. Just because people aren't engaging necessarily in violence offline doesn't mean you don't want to be focusing on their online behavior. They could be the one, like the dog whistlers, who are essentially riling up the violent users to perhaps engage in violence after. So I think I should have provided a little more nuance there. I guess what I was trying to get at was that based on what we're finding, it's the more silent users who are violent, essentially. But I don't think that analysts should be overlooking those 12 users, for example, because oftentimes they're the super posters. We are finding super posters in the sample. Surprisingly, there's some of the violent extremists are super posters as well, but the vast majority are the non-violent. And again, like I said before, they're most likely the opinion leaders in a lot of ways, and they're the people who are perhaps radicalizing others, perhaps further radicalizing the violent users, and that's something that should be explored for future research. So thanks for that point, John. Excellent.
Another question says, I'm conscious this was a national sample of Canadian right-wing extremists. Mm-hmm. Were there environmental factors at play in Canada that could have influenced online posting behavior over time? And do you think there will be benefits from running similar comparative studies across transnational settings?
Definitely. So, I mean, for this particular exercise and exploring this data in particular, I haven't looked at like the influence of key events. For example, I've done that on STORMFRONT, looking around presidential elections, but there were some key events in Canada. The introduction of LGBTQ rights, that had a big impact on online discussion. When I was coding up this data for grievances, express grievances, ideologies, and mobilization efforts, something that's is apparent is immigration and multiculturalism. That's had a significant impact, I would argue, on the online discussions there, as well as what users perceive as an increase in crimes committed by immigrants, as well as hate crime legislation. That seems to have had an influence on the discourse there. Now, I haven't measured it. I haven't systematically measured it, so I can't say for sure, but that's just generally what I'm seeing from a cursory glance of a sample of posts. Not coding necessarily for those particular events, but noticing that those are apparent discussions in that space. So definitely, offline events, what research has shown, and there's quite a big body of literature, surprisingly, on the influence of offline events and on online discourse of the extreme right, for example. It's offline events are interrelated to online discourse and vice versa.
Yeah, if I may sneak in a question on this topic, that's absolutely true. So if we look at, I don't know, hate crime variation over time, terrorist incidents in the country and overseas change the variation. Hate crime legislation, demographic change. And I imagine that some, I don't know how many, but I imagine some, maybe most of the violent right-wing extremists that you have coded might be hate crime offenders or categorized as hate crime offenders in other databases. So I wonder if we factor in all these other trigger events and variables in your regression model, it would be interesting to see how important is the online activity.
Definitely. I think you definitely see spikes, and I think you would see relationships between offline events like the hate crime legislation or mass immigration or perceptions of mass immigration, loss of white culture and online discourse. Definitely. Great point. Thank you.
Another question, great presentation, thanks. There is often a distinction made between online harm and offline harm. By breaking into nonviolent versus violent, your research makes the same distinction. But based on the posting behaviors of nonviolent, what would identify as online harms? And would you consider those harms, the online ones, equally severe as offline violence?
I mean, the purpose of this paper isn't to try to like say one is better, is greater than the other. Harm is harm, really. I would argue. Now, I haven't thought of it in those terms. I haven't. I guess my hope is that if doing this research, I acknowledge that these spaces are always going to exist. My hope is just that they're contained in a way. You know what I mean? Like my hope is that you don't get some of these super posters, whether they're violent or non-violent, starting to go in social media platforms that my son, for example, will see, or that Matteo, your son, will see one day. Because to me, that's harm. But to be honest, it's something that I'm going to have to explore in the future. I haven't given it enough thought to really give you a nuanced answer. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Ryan. Another question. I'm wondering if the decline in online activity among violent extremists over time is also because their focus moves to real-world offline activity and the online activity becomes less significant.
Yeah, that could definitely play a role. I mean, so some of these more violent users could post maybe a handful of messages, connect and communicate with other violent extremists in their neighborhood, and then maybe privately message them after, for example, or maybe get their cell phone number or something like that. There's a lot of factors. I mean, we don't know for sure. Some of them could have been incarcerated at the time. We don't know. Maybe they switched platforms as well. That could be a variable as well. We're generally seeing a decline, but we don't know exactly why. We can assume. Again, one of my assumptions was that they're fearful of law enforcement infiltration. That's a topic that I've constantly seen up in those discussions. Largely from the violent group, but also from the non-violent group. A lot of these individuals, according to this former extremist, were actively involved in the right-wing extremist movement. Not necessarily violence, but they were getting in some trouble. And based on the discussions I'm seeing, they're fearful, really paranoid actually, that law enforcement or anti-racist groups or watchdog groups are watching and try to infiltrate them. So I would argue that that's probably had the biggest impact. But again, something to explore for future research. That's a great question.
Absolutely. Actually, in our study in STORMFRONT, we wondered why there was a general decline between 2000 and 2015, we looked, in STORMFRONT. So one of our points was, well, maybe they're changing platforms. They're moving away. Maybe you are noticing that violent extremists are moving away?
It's possible. It's possible. From what I can gather, the Academy really hasn't found a meaningful way to track users across platforms, at least not going through proper IRB or RAB approval. I'm sure if you had IP addresses, you could probably track across platforms. It's not something I'm willing to do, but I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I can guess maybe. I would assume though, for my sample, it's the older guard of the movement. I mean, some of these folks have been involved since the 90s. So I don't think guys that are in their 40s and 50s or some maybe even in their 60s, I'm not sure, jumping to like the 4chans and the 8chans. I just don't think that's necessarily their style. But again, I don't know for sure.
Next question, Ryan, we have a lot. So I think we will go until the end. Do any of your findings indicate how users could challenge the common ideas and violent behaviors within their discussions? For example, what is the influence for prevention within these communities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I don't know, because like when I was coding the data, it was tough to code. It's really negative discourse. And from what I've been reading and from doing some research, it's pretty difficult to go into these platforms and be like, no, you know, like anti-Semitism is bad. You know, you're gonna get kicked off the platform. I'm more in favor of preventative strategies, prevent people from actually going down these pathways and starting to become a super poster on Stormfront, for example. That's the approach that I'd take. But I mean, I'd like to think that you could go into these platforms and try to create a critical discussion about ZOG, Zionist occupied governments, but I just don't think you can do that in these platforms, at least based on what I'm seeing. If someone can offer a better suggestion, I'm more than willing to listen. I guess I'm pessimistic in that sense. My goal is to try and work on the ground with communities to prevent people from actually going down these pathways.
Would you expect a difference between time spent online, number of pages read, likes of posts, so hours spent online in general between the two groups? For example, would you have access to this information, and would you expect a difference given the modifying behavior to avoid detection?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that type of data. We have just fairly basic. We have username, user ID, when they joined the forum, how many posts they made, how many subforum posts, and then we can kind of develop different measures based on that. I haven't looked at it systematically. I think the violent users are also actively spending a lot of time in these platforms. I would argue that they're probably not liking or posting as much as the non-violent group to avoid detection, because the 49 users are violent extremists. And there's some pretty interesting stories around these individuals. So I would assume that they'd be fearful of having a real presence online. But we don't have that type of information, unfortunately. But it's a great question. I would assume there are differences, but I haven't explored it in a systematic manner, unfortunately. But great question.
Do you have any plans on looking at other websites or forums, maybe compare between websites and forums?
Yeah, so I mean, the solo paper I've been talking about, like kind of coding indicators of extremism amongst violent and nonviolent. I'm going to compare those results to another paper I recently published in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism with some co-authors, where we had the same code book, but we coded on violent right-wing extremist forums, not like a generic Stormfront. We coded on Iron March and Fascist Forge, notorious spaces. But I mean, in an ideal world, I could have information on the violent and nonviolent extremists in Iron March and Fascist Forge or Gab, 4chan, 8chan, all of these platforms. I just don't have access to it. And it's just, I was very lucky to be able to get these lists of known violence and known nonviolent right-wing extremists on Stormfront. And I acknowledge that Stormfront's an older space. It's been losing momentum. It's still relatively popular, but to me, it's not the most ideal space. To look at like the newer generation of right-wing extremists. It's good in the sense that like Mateo's has swaths of data over like long periods of time. So you can do some pretty funky longitudinal analyses with it. I mean, so back to your question, in an ideal world, I'd love to compare violent versus nonviolent extremists across multiple platforms. I just need to find a way to be able to identify those violent and nonviolent extremists on other spaces.
When coding the material, so your latest solo adventure, was there any evidence of troll behavior from users challenging extreme right-wing ideology?
No, not at all. I mean, it's just like a big high five session, essentially, for lack of a way of putting it. There's some internal squabbles going on about like, oh, you're not extreme enough. But I mean, there's just a general consensus of extremism, I guess. I mean, so I sampled 3,000 posts out of, I don't know, 150,000 posts. So I mean, obviously it's not representative. It's not. It's still a large sample, but within those messages, nothing was coming out to me around people kind of challenging extremist beliefs in the sense that they're saying, oh, like you shouldn't believe in the extremist views. That's not. This isn't the type of space for that. It's a space for largely like-minded individuals from all around the world who largely feel like they're left out of society to connect and communicate with others who share the same views as them. And that's largely what I was noticing. Like I said, there's some variations in terms of people kind of squabbling about how extreme you are. Not much though, but on other platforms that might see something different. One of my graduate students has been looking at an incel forum, and she's noticed that there's people going on these incel forums challenging others on their extremist views. I guess it just depends on the platform. But again, it's something to explore for future research.
You referred to this earlier, but can you elaborate on what your research says about the echo chambers argument?
Yeah, so I mean, so some of my prior research has kind of upheld this view that a place like Stormfront is an echo chamber of hate. Based on this paper, we're not really seeing that, at least based on these users. I mean, if we looked at the entire forum, we might see that echo chamber effect. But based on this relatively small sample of violent and nonviolent users, we're seeing them desist in their posting behavior over time. But there could be other people that we don't have in our sample that are kind of taking over the reign and keeping that momentum going in terms of extremist ideologies over time. Looking at echo chambers wasn't really the purpose of this paper, but it could be something that we explore in the future. Based on what we're seeing, it doesn't look like from a temporal perspective we're seeing this echo chamber. And I'm talking long time. It's in the sample, it's in the data, it's 54 months. If I go back, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the figures shows that from about up until about month 13, we are seeing a spike in posting behavior. I mean, we could see a development of an echo chamber in that period of time. Maybe after that period of time, there's other people, like I said, not in our sample, who are continuing that momentum. But again, it's something to explore for future research. Great question.
Ryan, what do you think of the argument that, you know, more extreme attitudes correspond to more extreme behaviors? So I know you haven't explored these questions specifically, but based on what you have looked at, so do you think that the violent extremist cohort would be more extreme in the language used?
No, no, I don't think they are. So this is part of the coding exercise that I was doing. No, I'm not noticing that at all. So there's a couple of things in this coding thing. One, the nonviolent users are expressing extremist ideologies at a much higher rate than non-violent extremists. And they're expressing extremist ideologies at a moderately higher rate than the random sample. So then I guess I'll just call it like the general subforum. They're also mobilizing at much higher rates online than the nonviolent extremists and at a moderately higher rate than the random sample. And what's very apparent when you read through these messages, and one of the reasons why it's just taken me a little time to get through the coding, is the nonviolent extremists, like the length of their posts they're just really long, and they're just really negative. I'm noticing that the violent users, they're still negative, but they're short and punchy. Like they just kind of get it out and that's it. The non-violent users, I would argue they're probably the opinion leaders because they're not sophisticated at all, but I would argue they're probably more sophisticated in the way that they present their arguments, or more, I don't know, leadership quality in the way that they post compared to the violent users, because they post very detailed, descriptive accounts of what they perceive as whatever the threat is for the week. So yeah, there are definitely differences. But the key is to try to get a bigger sample than what we have, and to try to get a sample that reflects maybe a broader forum instead of just a subforum of a larger forum. But again, the reason why we went with the subforum is because this individual, this former extremist, was largely involved in the movements associated with that subform. So that's how he or she could identify those users of interest.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Ryan. It was fabulous. I'm sure everyone, and we had a good group attending. I've seen over 50 people, 56 or 57 at a certain point. So I'm sure we all enjoyed a lot. So thank you so much. I guess I leave it to Michelle to say the closing remarks, but I think it was really great, and thank you for sharing your new projects. It generates a lot of interest and new ideas for all of us.
Thanks, Matteo.
Okay, thank you, Matteo, and thanks, Ryan. My only closing remark is, wow, what a fantastic presentation. Really, really topical, lots and lots to think about, both methodologically, but also in terms of what you've plotted out in relation to future research. I think you've sparked the beginning of a really fascinating research trajectory that both you and others are going to be very, very keen to pursue further. Thank you, everybody, for coming along today. And please stay tuned for future AVERT webinars. And Ryan, I know that we'll be having you back.
Thanks very much for having me.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye now.